before my show, but yeah, I'm starting to get hungry again.
Yeah. The chairman, Jinping, gave us $5. Thank you very much, Chairman. He said, what are some other things Marx liked about Lincoln and the Union besides ending slavery and viewing blacks as the international proletariat? Wouldn't we agree with a lot of the critiques of the South's backward, oligarchic, cash crop-driven society?
Yeah. No, I have a very nuanced opinion on that. I can see the both sides. Yeah, I don't agree with the Southern view either on the Civil War. On some level, if you look at even the history of Europe and all over the world during this time, you see a similar tendency, which is, in order to industrialize your country, you kind of have to figure out a way to push past the landowning class.
Yeah, but you always say that. I don't buy that commie bullshit. Like you say that all the time. And
that's not an argument. That's not an argument. What you buy or not isn't an argument.
Well, here's my point.
Is it true? Can you have an industrial revolution with a 17th century feudalistic slave owning class in your economy, holding all the most important parts of your property and textiles? Can you do that? You tell me. Show me an example of that happening.
I would have to prepare some well-reasoned arguments against that. Well, let me just say though, this is just because I can't get in. I don't have the stuff ready to really get into it. But I will say just a few things that strike me as off with that.
Okay.
One of them is the fact that I think the Southern economy would have been fine had they been able to trade internationally with Europe. I mean, they were doing very well. Like they were not having a problem. They were doing very well, and they would have continued to do well. I mean, the fact is that they were prevented from seceding from the Union by what was essentially like a war of annihilation, blockades, and then burning cities and things like that. I don't think that was part of some sort of Stalin-esque industrialization policy, especially since the South was just occupied and a lot of the wealth and everything was just stripped in the same way that, in the same way with the oligarchs took control when the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, they just looted it. They just looted the South. It wasn't like a planned, like, here's how we're going to do this. I also think that when you look at the Northern motive, I agree with the Southern perspective that it was just capitalists in the North. It wasn't some kind of high-minded, like, for our national interests.
Oh, absolutely. Well,
that. Well, I mean, it was. I don't. I mean, look at the railroads. Look at the railroads. Look at the way the railroads. That was the sort of side thing that came out of me at the Money Kings. Was you talk about the inefficiency of capitalism, the totally. The railroads were everything but a rational plan to industrialize and make good transportation like the Autobahn across the American continent. It was a complete just shit show of rival capitalists and grift fucking each other over. So I don't think that excuse works for Lincoln.
Well, we can speculate about the alternatives of what would have happened. But here's what we do know from established history, from how history played out. After the Civil War, America became a global empire and the most powerful economy in the world. So,
I mean, I would say this:
why was okay? Let me ask you a question. Why was the North able to outproduce the South so significantly to the point of the South losing the war if the Southern system was more efficient or efficient, period?
Well, I would say this. The bigger argument, if you want to make like a practical argument like that, like sometimes,
I'm not a fan of Lincoln. I'm not a fan of Lincoln, but I can see the
terrible. Sometimes you just got to do bad shit. Like
right.
You could make an argument, I think, that has far less to do with industrialization. I don't think that argument holds water. I think that the argument that is a much more just a classic geopolitical argument, is that no country in the world is going to let that much of its territory secede.
But why was the South seceding? They were seceding because Lincoln wanted to concentrate American resources for Northern industry, while the South wanted to trade with Europe for what the arrangements were already. So Lincoln says, we can't afford to pay you what the Europeans are paying, but these are American resources. But Lincoln is actually, in a strange way, making a nationalist argument. Again, I don't agree with Lincoln on everything.
No, I mean,
maybe 50%.
That to me, Joe, is why it's so absurd and grotesque for Southerners to fly the American flag. And now James Edwards doesn't. He told me, I joked with him. I said, James, I thought you were more like conservative patriot. And he's like, are you kidding? He's like, my kids wipe their feet on the American flag. He's like, that's like always in my household.
One could say the opposite argument is that Southerners didn't consider themselves American, right? And then that's why you have secession, right? But if Southerners are Americans, then being expected to lose money in the short term to build your nation's economy in the long term should be expected of you. And there's a reason why in every society that's industrializing, you see a similar, even if they have different names and they play out differently. In the French Revolution, they killed all the landowners. In China, the thing Mao did was he wiped out all of the aristocratic landowners to expropriate their land, and he did was it the land reform, right? The basic problem that you have this is a kind of a Marxist argument, but it's played out in history through different theaters. The basic problem you have when you're transitioning from a feudal economy to an industrial economy is that feudal economic interests don't want to industrialize because they lose out. Now, you could argue that the people that inherit this power, the capitalists or money power, are worse or less moral or whatever. You can't deny that they develop your economy. Right. In that far more than a feudal system does. I mean, part of the reason the Tsar's attempts at industrializing the Russian economy failed was, again, because of these rent-seeking landowning interests that they're not good for industrializing your country.
How did it go down in Britain? I mean, because Britain's
the exception to the rule, and that's because the
Britain
landowners
was the first one that industrialized. I mean, it was the first country.
And that's because the landowners themselves volunteered to become capitalists. There's the famous saying that many British landowners had, which is a rich man puts all of his money in factories. Poor or a downwardly mobile man puts all of his money into servants. So that's the thing.
Right.
In Britain, for whatever reason, the aristocrats there were happy to become sweaty capitalists on a factory floor. In other parts of the world, that wasn't true. And that includes parts of America, like the South. Remember, the South had an entrenched aristocracy.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, again, I just look at that as like power struggle. And I think that, there was a problem with the Southern strategy going into the Civil War was to not be too aggressive with the North because they didn't want to get accused of fighting a war of aggression or of invasion or of provoking, of making, like, losing potential allies in Europe, of getting the North, to feel like they're under attack. And that just goes against, that goes against, I mean, that's why Napoleon would always strike first. Napoleon would, like, if somebody declares war on him, he doesn't wait for them to invade his territory. He hits them first with everything he's got. That's the way, generally speaking. That's why powers like Japan and Germany, the Blitzkrieg thing, when you're at a disadvantage against a power that has more industry and more people and it can win in a long war of attrition, your only chance is to hit them really fucking hard right out of the gate and just blitzkrieg them and knock them out. The one time that Lee did that, the Gettysburg campaign was almost, very successful. So I think that's a big problem. That was a big problem with the Civil War. But I think it has less to do with
other than Britain, where the aristocracy in Britain all became capitalists, but they did that volunteering. They voluntarily did that. But there were instances where the aristocracy didn't want to do that. And so how do you get through that problem of having all of your land being held by people that don't want to industrialize your country? What do you do? Like,
but I mean, I don't think that
you have to fight them, or
I don't think that the South
pay them off or something.
I mean, you can't compare though the landowners of the South were a capitalist class. I mean, they were. See, this is my thing. Everything in the colonies, post the colonies, like after they became the republic, it was still run the exact same way the colonies were run, which was for profit, capitalist for profit. We can call the South aristocratic, but let's face it, it never had an aristocracy. There were no titled aristocrats. The way
the plantations, like planters.
The plantation. I mean, the plantation is a capitalist model. I mean, it's basically a big farm.
But it's an outdated one in a time of industrialization, right?
How is it outdated? You still need the cotton. You still need people to grow and pick the cotton.
Yes, but as you have the method of doing it is what's outdated. Wage labor is more efficient than slavery. So
is it? Yes. It was very profitable to use slave labor at the time. I mean, if wage labor,
because slave labor is not mobile. You see what I mean? Like,
because it's tied to
right. It's not. You can't mobilize slave labor like you can wage labor.
I mean, I have some books on this that if you want to have this debate sometime, we can. The way I see it is, it was just like the oligarchs in Russia. What the northern capitalists did was they broke down the South completely. They broke down their economy, their culture, their society, their government, everything about it, so that they could just go into it, completely permeate it, and not with, like I say, not with any kind of Stalin, I think, is, if you're going to take that model, like, Stalin is much more like future thinking and broad-minded than the northern capitalists that went in and just like raped the South. It wasn't some kind of thing like, oh, this will make us great. The other thing is, I don't think that America did become a world power really until the First World War.
Well, hold on a second. Like,
I mean, you could say,
how did America have the ability to fight a war across the Atlantic Ocean to the extent it did?
Sure,
because of decades of becoming an industrial powerhouse.
The fact also, just the fact that, and this is why I don't even like, when I hear those arguments, I don't even like to hear them, because the practical effect of Lincoln's War was to take that bound black labor that was bound to the South and unleash it on the North as wage labor in all the cities, which was the inevitable outcome of what they did. So again,
but that's the point of the mobility of labor. Like, having like an army of workers that live on your estate your whole life until they're dead is not conducive to a modern economy. It's just not. So we can debate on the ethics of it, on the benefit of it, and so on. But if you want to have modern country with industry, you can't have that. It's just inefficient. So there's a reason, Warren, why every single country that industrializes has this problem where they have to do this. There's always some big explosive conflict that occurs, and it's usually between the landed interests and the industrial interests that the fight is over.
I mean, I get that, but again, I don't see Lincoln's motive even as that. I mean, it's like I don't see that that's what they actually did to the South. I mean, because why not just let the South go then? I mean, if that's the thing, if your economy is so much more efficient, why not just let them walk away? You've got everything you can deal with them. Why was a war necessary that's going to kill, more than 500,000 Americans?
I think the Southern argument is like, well, we're just doing what the Constitution says we can do, which is that when this union isn't working for us, we just leave. The problem is the Constitution is completely naive. Like that's never going to happen. Why should the federal government let you leave? Especially if you have all of the cotton and all of the raw materials that they need. That's not going to happen. It's just never going to happen. So, I think that's a debate. I have a very nuanced view on that. I against what Lincoln did after the war more than anything in terms of Reconstruction. That's for sure. Now,
I think the war was totally unjustifiable, though. I mean, I think the war is totally totally
no one is going to let you secede from their country. That's just how it is.
Right. But I mean, like it's like that's like saying that the U.S. is totally right to back Ukraine against Russia because no country that has America's geopolitical dominance is going to. I think that's like a moral relativist.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, the difference is Europe didn't spend or send all of its weapons to the South to fight the Civil War, right? Like the reality of the big country versus the little country is what decides that. Well, America is artificially tipping the scales in Ukraine, where it's not to Ukraine's benefit because it's an unwinnable war.
Well, it's funny you say that because the argument you made that this is what set it up so that America could fight a war in continental Europe, 60, 70 years later, speaks to the fact that the European powers were wrong not to arm the South and supply the South much more than they did. Because if they had done that, if the European powers had really made sure, had done what Zog is doing with Ukraine, if they had done it with the Confederacy, then they wouldn't have had a situation where this giant united continent is invading Europe 70 years later.
I mean, that's all hindsight, my friend. That's not. Now, I think I can be objective from the position of Zog. I don't agree with rightoids that like America First people that say, "Oh, the Ukraine, what a waste." It's actually not a waste. The United States is using Ukrainians as cannon fodder to try and cling to world power. And it's not a bad investment, actually, from their perspective. It's not my perspective. But from their perspective, sending Ukrainians to die by the hundreds of thousands to slow Russia down as a world challenger to the liberal post-war order is actually, it makes perfect sense. Like, I'm not saying it's wrong. It's not, it makes perfect sense from their perspective. The problem is I don't want to preserve the liberal post-war post-World War II order. That's not in my race's interest. It's not in the white race's interest. That's in the Jewish race's interest. So from their perspective, there's a good reason why all these kikes like Applebaum and Packer and
I know.
Well, and it actually makes perfect sense.
Again, that's my argument from about Lincoln is that from the northern capitalist point of view, the war makes sense. From a national people, the war doesn't make sense because all you're going to do is break open that giant pool of black labor that's going to be used then in your cities. So
do you think so? The problem is that a lot of the logic in the South was this kind of libertarian, not cosmopolitan, but this sort of libertarian, like I don't owe anyone anything. But then, like, what should you do in the position of Lincoln if you're saying, "Hey, South, sell me your textiles for this amount of money. It's all we can afford. We need to industrialize America." And the South says, "Well, the British and the French or whatever are paying me more, so I'm going to sell only to them." Like, what should you do if you're in Lincoln's position?
But I mean,
let's take the Confederacy out of it, right? Let's take just generic nation A and generic nation B. If generic nation A needs raw materials from the southern part of its country, that they're all in one country and they need raw materials, but they only have enough money to the point where foreign actors can buy it for more money. And so this region of the country says, well, they're paying me more. Why the hell should I sell to you? Does nationhood matter in that situation? Do you owe your country the right to access your materials first when you're in the same country? Like, do you owe your country that? And should you be militarily compelled to do it if you say no?
What about the fact that though the Congress had the power to impose tariffs? I mean, like, I don't know the history well enough to look into
and that's
this.
why the South seceded. It was over tariffs from Congress. They rejected Congress's tariffs, and that's when they declared the secession.
Right, but I mean, it's something that, like I said, I think that I just think that the war was not fought in. I mean, it was fought.
I'm saying what
like all American wars, like all American wars. I think almost every single American war was fought in the. Let me just finish. It was fought in the interests of a. I sound like Bernie Sanders. I'm going to sound like Bernie Sanders. The capitalist class. I think that it was fought in the interests of the Northern capitalist class. It was certainly not fought in the interests of the Northern people. And I say that as someone who is a Northerner and was a Northerner and a Yankee completely on both sides of my family. I mean, imagine if that war was being fought today. Like, imagine going and volunteering to, like, invade the South or something. And when I visit these Civil War battlefields, and I just think of the mass slaughter, the bloodiest battles ever fought on this continent by far. Let me ask you
though, what if Hitler was in power and he needs
it's interesting
hold on, and he needs Bavaria and he needs food from Bavaria, right? Let's say it's a 4-year plan. It's the 4-year plan, and the mission is we're going to make Germany agriculturally self-sufficient. And then all the farmers in Bavaria say, well, the French are offering me 2 or 3 times the money for my crops that you are. So I'm just going to sell all this food to them. What the fuck do you think Hitler would have done?
Well, I'm glad you say that, because I will say this. The difference between the capitalists running the country then or the communists that were running the country at the start of the Russian Revolution, the difference between these people and Mussolini and Hitler is that Mussolini and Hitler were true nationalists. They came out of German and Italian unification, out of that movement, 19th century movement. They were nationalists, and they resolved their country's internal problems through reconciliation, not through bloody civil wars. And I think that is one of the defining qualities of National Socialism and Italian fascism, is that they did not resort to bloody civil wars.
Well, what if Bavaria voted for a secession and said, well, we're just going to leave. If you put tariffs on stuff, we're just going to leave the Third Reich.
Well, I mean, just leaving this.
Come on, dude.
Wait. Leaving that specific
question. Twist reality just to
but listen, leaving that specific question aside, because that's a very particular thing tied to the time and place.
It applies to almost every nation. You can't do that.
But Hitler had a very real Bavarian separatist. There was a very real Bavarian separatist.
What did he think of that?
Well, I know what he thought of it. The same thing was true with what happened with Ernst Röhm and I mean, Hitler didn't kill the Junkers. He didn't wipe out the Junkers. He didn't do bloody civil war. And I think because as a nationalist, it would have gone against his whole reason for everything that he's doing. Part of the reason why the SA and why he decapitated Röhm and all that, the reason why he didn't do that in 1934, he didn't let them get away with that, is because what they were gearing up for. And this would have been a very commie thing.
How did the Junkers thank Hitler?
I know you can say that, Joe, but
how about this? How did the king that Mussolini preserved thank him?
Well, that's why I said this is a commie point of view.
Well,
what I'm
it's
saying
not a commie point of view, because if you ask
point of view.
Mussolini, he would tell you the same thing in 1943.
The reality
he'd be
is,
like, I should have
Hitler,
killed this guy when I had the chance. And Hitler,
right? But
after the 44 plot, would say the same thing. So again,
but there's no way, there is zero chance that Hitler would have. That's why he had all those guys shot, because the idea of taking the Reichswehr, as it was at that time, and pitting it against the SA would have just been a total disaster.
I agree. No, I agree. It's a difficult position to be in, especially.
And I mean, if you were Lincoln, like it's like, why not shoot the fucking leaders or put them on trial or something? You know, there would have been a way. I guarantee you, had Adolf Hitler been in Abraham Lincoln's position, he would have found a way to negotiate a solution without going to war. That everything about Lincoln's war was fought exactly the same way they fought World War I and World War II. It was fought with some phony human rights shit that we've come up with, some race crap that we got to say, some puritanical Cromwell style, like there's this holy crusade that we got to preserve freedom and save some oppressed race. And then the methods were blockade, starve women and children, rampage through cities, it was completely.
One could make the argument that that's what Lincoln was an American nationalist.
Oh, he was. I don't disagree with that.
Maybe that's what American nationalism is. I'm not saying it is or not. I'm just saying, the sort of moral vision that Lincoln had maybe is the core of what it means to be an American nationalist.
You know who would agree with that? Sam Harris. Sam Harris and Ben Shapiro.
Oh yeah,
I think it is. But I say to you that Hitler and Mussolini, I think, would have found a way to solve that particular, problem. And part of it would have been
I would argue that they lost the war because they didn't solve the problem how they should have. But that's a debate for another day.
Yeah, we'll save that for another day, or we'll be here all night.
Yeah.
But yeah, I that's what I think. I think they would have found a way to solve it without that war. All right, that was it on entropy. Let me double check, and we'll go over to Odyssey.